Okay, so I wanted to make this quick video on mixing metal bass and try to share some of the things I've learned on my journey so far. So most of the advice you come across online when it comes to mixing metal bass, it tends to be kind of keep it simple, stupid in nature. And for me personally, this hasn't worked at all, and I'm not particularly surprised. When you have a lot of experience, when you really know what you're doing, then of course it's simple. I mean, you know exactly how a particular plugin is going to affect the sound. You can quickly identify when you need compression. You know how the track is later on going to respond to a limiter and the whole mastering process, so on and so forth. As a beginner, you might have some kind of intellectual conceptualization of what a compressor does, so on and so forth, but you're not going to know when you need it necessarily. In fact, a lot of the time you're going to be wrong about what you need. You don't have that whole intuition built into you. You don't have the experience. So this video will be aimed more at that whole stumbling around blindly trying to get better results. So this whole clip is from a cover of Tornado of Souls I recently did. I'm going to play the bass first in context of the song and then in isolation.
This morning I made that call, the one that ends it all.
And in isolation. And finally, I'm also going to play it without any effects on, so the raw recording. I'm pulling up the volume so you can actually hear it. All right, so the first point I wanted to make doesn't really have anything to do with mixing, but as you could hear, the recording wasn't the cleanest. The dynamics of it wasn't as even as you would ideally want it to be. But the broad point I want to make is that you are at whatever skill level you are at currently, and there's not going to be a big difference between 3 quick takes and 20 takes across 2 days when it comes to quality. It's really not worth the effort to do 20 takes. Most of the time just do 3 quick takes and move on, because you're not going to make any significant progress in a few days. If you have some particular short part where whatever instrument is really going to shine, then sure, spend some extra time on that. But for the most part, just get a few quick recordings down and move on. If you later on in life want to revisit it, then do that. But like I said, like a week of practice, it just doesn't really matter. It takes a lot longer than that to build up significant skill. So a few quick takes and move on. The next thing I wanted to talk about was the broad picture of what we're actually looking for when it comes to metal bass, because I find personally I made the mistake, and I think a lot of other people make the same mistake, of over pursuing the clankiness. So what you think you're looking for, a really clanky Iron Maiden type of sound. And so, of course, when you pursue it, you really go for the high frequencies and stuff. And that tends to really backfire, because what you're really looking for is for a big-ass wall of sound punching you for every note. And when you have too much of clankiness, then all you end up with is a really, really annoying in your ear that is just going to kill you. Nobody wants to listen to that. So what you actually end up doing in reality is that you end up scooping out a lot of frequencies that are, especially in the mid to high mid range, that are going to murder your ears once you apply a lot of compression, saturation, distortion, whatever, and eventually probably limiting. In general, you're going to remove a lot of mids, because when you distort, when you limit, it's going to bring up a lot of the mids back again and again. you want a big fat wall of sound, and you don't want things sticking out too much. It's just a solid wall of sound. The same goes for the low mids. There's usually things there strangling the mix, and you want to try to open it up. And again, you do a lot of just simply scoping things out. The general sound you're looking for is generally pretty scoped out as well, because it's a lot easier to get a good mix that way when you leave a lot of room for the guitars and the vocals. There's nothing at all wrong with a mid-heavy bass. It's perfectly doable. I'm thinking of like the original Tornado of Souls recording, or most of Iron Maiden is pretty mid-heavy. But it's a lot harder to mix, I find. It's a lot harder to balance. You don't get the same depth when you try to move some of it to the guitar. So you either end up with a really standalone kick or kind of muddy-ish guitars. It's very hard to balance. But yeah, in general, what you're looking for is heavy compression, a lot of saturation, a lot of distortion, and probably limiting, because you want a wall of sound just hitting you in the face, and you don't want in that wall you do want some higher frequencies, of course, some clarity, but you're really trying to make sure that there's nothing sticking out too much in that wall of sound. So next I wanted to bring up this chain, and so this Ferox plugin you see here, this is a tape saturation. You can see that it's spread out all over this chain, and the point I wanted to make here is that you need to keep in mind that distortions, saturations, compressors as well, limiters, they respond differently depending on where in the chain they are. It really matters if you put them before an equalizer or after an equalizer. So don't be afraid of using multiple different or the same saturation or distortion in your chain in different places. You don't need to just have one equalizer at one place, and then one saturation, and then one whatever else, and then be done. Because again, it's going to respond differently depending on where in the chain you put it. And like I said, we're stumbling across blindly, so don't be afraid of doing it. Another point I want to make is we're gonna see like some of this is just crazy. I must like just insane, like this right here. This is batshit. I think I have something worse somewhere as well. Well, regardless. Oh yeah, here we go. This is really crazy. This is some really heavy equalizing going on, and you can see there's a lot of scooping out annoying frequencies, again, because we want in that wall, we don't want things sticking out too much. But this type of very aggressive equalizing you should not be afraid of. And if you think about a cab simulator, which is very common to use on bass as well as guitars, those are extreme in what they do in terms of the whole sound picture. So that's insane equalizing if you want to mimic what a amp simulator would do. So don't be afraid of going crazy with the equalizer. The track needs whatever it needs. You, like they say, mix with your ears. For sure, a lot of what I'm doing here is like moving stuff back and forth, and some of this stuff is like completely pointless in the end, because I boosted it one time and then I've decreased it at some other point, and yeah, I mean, but that's just the way it ended up. Another point I would say is that keep in mind that saturations and distortions and stuff, they really bring up the mids. So you usually end up cutting out a lot of mids before you apply heavy distortion. And again, keep in mind it really matters where in the chain you have different things. So don't be afraid of using it at multiple different places. Another thing is compression. you do want to use chain compression. You don't want one compressor working too hard. You want it spread out. So these two are identical, except that one has a lower ratio than the other. That's the only difference. And I think these are the same as well. Yes, one has a heavy ratio, but otherwise they're the same. Now, as you can see here, I ended up using only one track. Most of the time, people split it up into 2 or 3 tracks. There are a lot of advantages to doing this. So one common approach is that you have a low-end track, and then you have a distortion track, and then you have a kind of clean track. It makes it easy to blend, and like I said, it really matters where in the chain you use a distortion or saturation. It will respond differently depending on what you're feeding into it. And when you have a specific distortion track, then it's easier to control the distortion. So there are a lot of benefits to it. Some downsides is that you can get phase issues that are really annoying to deal with. And for the most part, I find I get the results I'm looking for better with one track. Another benefit is if you use two different, if you split it up into 2 tracks and you use 2 different amp simulators. As you can see here, I'm not using any amp simulator. I have a reverb just to make it smoother, I guess, take off some of the edges. But it's very common to use an amp simulator, nothing wrong with it. And if you use 2 different amp simulators, they're going to respond a little bit differently. They're going to have different frequencies where they respond more and less, and so they're going to balance each other out a little bit. And so this is kind of like an easy way of getting a more even bass sound because they balance each other out. So you don't need to go as crazy with compression and stuff. It's just a very easy way of getting better results. But again, you have 2 tracks that you need to work with. It's more parameters. It's easier to get lost. So again, it's a good approach, but you don't need to do it, but keep that in mind. The last thing I just wanted to touch on here is about using references. So I'm going to remove some of these because I think it's going to highlight the fact that I was really using the original bass in Tornado of Souls, the original recording, as a reference. So yeah, as you can hear in how I started out, I was really going for that mid-heavy kind of sound that you find in the original Tornado of Souls. But what I later found out was that I couldn't make it work. And I ended up using All Nightmare Long by Metallica as a reference. So if you compare, it's a lot more along those lines than it is the original Megadeth recording. And it's fantastic when you don't know what you're doing, that there are isolated bass tracks that you can use as an influence. So not only can you can listen to your mix and then you can reference it to another mix you like, but you can also then solo your bass and you can solo the bass of a mix you like, and you can also sort of help navigate yourself that way if you're heading in a smart direction or not. So definitely use that to your advantage, I think. It's a great way of learning what kind of sounds actually work in a mix and what you might be doing wrong. I mean, it can take you a long time to then figure out how to get towards that sound, but that is how you learn. Now, all of the plugins I use here are free. Most of them are stock plugins for Reaper, but the Ferox one, I think, is the only one that isn't. Yes, the Ferox one is downloaded, but it's free. I really like this plugin, by the way. I use it on almost everything. Vocals, I even think I added it to guitars just to get some warmth to them and stuff. But yeah, I think that covers most of it. Don't be afraid of going crazy. It's the only way you're going to learn, to be honest. So yeah, thanks for listening and watching.